For the record, what I deal with mostly has to do with psychology, with thinking or how to think. I'm not really about pushing for any of my specific ideas to be adopted offhand, because I could be wrong about any or everything that I state. And if I am, and I advocate for people to adopt my ideology, then I'm sabotaging my own quest for a revolution and a resolution to what I view as the problem. What I do promote is for African people to exercise independent thought. And if any of us are so mired in the psychopathology of the West, then you may want to take a look at what your people accomplished in times past, independent of involvement from non-African people, in order to get some idea of what you helped to come up with when you were left to your own devices. Aside from that, I also heavily promote using common sense. Bearing this in mind, I would like to present an argument, a perspective. It's a point I've found myself having to make in different kinds of conversations to African people mostly, though not exclusively, due to unreasonable expectations we have of our people considering the circumstances. And this isn't about making excuses for us, but it is a recognition of a self-defeatist notion we have, where we have no desire to actually get out of the sick environment in which we live, but instead we expect for our people to be able to somehow live in sickness and be okay. And if we're not okay living in sickness, then there's something wrong with us or deficient about us or whatever. It's like some kind of maladaptive psychology left over from the times of chattel slavery, where we view the inability of some to overcome dire circumstances, either at all or within a certain time frame, as a sort of failure to prove themselves worthy. Whether it's ghetto conditions in general or the prison system or what have you, we view them like a rites of passage type of thing. You're tough if you can get through it, and you're soft otherwise. That's how we look at it on an individual level, absolutely ignoring people's respective differences as it concerns strengths and weaknesses as human beings. And as a group, since we often find that we disproportionately suffer from a lot more of this ugliness than other groups of people, we take the position that it's due, again, to some deficiency on our part and some superior trait on the part of other groups. Whenever I have tried to present explanations as it regards environmental factors or social factors for why we think and behave in certain ways, why certain things affect us in ways that it either doesn't with other people or not as pronouncedly, as well as how to effectively counter the obstacles and so on, it is all dismissed under one of any number of popular programmed responses. Oh, those are just excuses, or that's just a conspiracy theory, and so on and so forth. Now, personally, I'm of the opinion that those of us who are ready to take things to another level for themselves and for our people need to just go ahead and do so. My perspective is not that we need to wait around for every black person to get on one accord. Get it going whenever you're ready to do so. It doesn't take everybody to change things. My opinion is that while we're moving ahead with plans for empowerment of our people in every imaginable way, we must also become formidable competitors in every sector of society. Why? Because there is a systematic reason why things are progressively and exponentially becoming worse for our people as a functioning group. However, instead of going into the whys from my own observations, as well as from researching the works of black psychologists and behavioral scientists, I'm going to present the current resulting society within which black children are growing up, and I'm going to put it in perspective as best as I can. Article 2 of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide defines genocide as, quote, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, I can show how each and every single one of the acts mentioned in the international definition of genocide has been and still is being employed against African people right now. However, sadly, what I often find that I have to do in order to make some Africans see themselves as human beings is use another group of people as an example. With that said, imagine, if you will, the Jews over in Israel. Imagine if they lived in a society where their children in schools were taught to look up to Nazis as heroes, benefactors, forefathers, revolutionaries, pioneers, and so on. Imagine if they lived in a society where they have murals and statues of Nazis in schools, parks, museums, libraries, and all government property. Imagine that they had plays in school where they donned the roles of Nazis in veneration of them. Imagine that when they were being driven around in their society, they see pictures of Nazis on the license plates of cars, and the roads they drove on bore the names of Nazis. Imagine that the schools the children went to bore the name of Hitler and other prominent Nazis. Imagine that the money they work hard for had the depictions of Nazis on them. Imagine that they had holidays dedicated to them. Imagine that when they turned on television, they would be bombarded with these images all the same. Documentaries extolling Nazis or proclaiming them to be misunderstood and complicated individuals. The TV movies of the week and the blockbuster theatrical releases are about the great Nazi heroes. Mind you, this doesn't actually fully encapsulate the extent of our situation. We're not even getting into the religious aspect of what we have to deal with, the loss of our culture and language, and the active promotion in the society we live in of our original spiritual systems, culture, and language, or traces thereof, as being evil, or at the very least, undesirable elements. African culture is outdated and therefore a liability. White culture is modern and futuristic, or at least compatible with the future. Other times it'll be that culture is neutral and therefore we may as well remain in the one in which we're already immersed. And what I'm describing is not a new occurrence. It is what transpired during the height of our physical ordeal, and it is what has continued to transpire ever since. It's been a steady diet for the entirety of the existence of this country of, well, something that Marcus Garvey said a long time ago, nearly 100 years ago as a matter of fact. Propaganda has done more to defeat the good intentions of races and nations than even open warfare. We of the Negro race are suffering more than any other race in the world from propaganda. Propaganda to destroy our hopes, our ambitions, and our confidence in self. We live in a society that is absolutely hostile to our existence in every way imaginable. We live in a society that is actively at war with us. America is a shrine to white domination and the oppression of African people. Just look around. You ask a Jew to put their children in even a remotely similar situation as what we find ourselves in, and they will look at you as though you are insane. Why? Because the situation we live in is absolutely insane. It is completely topsy-turvy and ass backwards. And what's the cherry on top? Imagine that in the Jewish scenario, a known and admitted Jew heads up the Nazi Party. Put the picture I just painted as it regards the Jews into perspective and tell me that doesn't sound like a quintessential Twilight Zone episode. This isn't by any means or stretch of the imagination a normal situation, and it affects some of us more severely and pronounced than others. We ain't all starting at the same line headed towards the finish. That right there is where African people start. way behind in terms of the psychological trauma and damage that is inflicted upon us from an early age that affects the way we look at ourselves, our historical captors, their descendants and beneficiaries, and our whole outlook on life. Learning how to balance everything is a matter of maturity. It's something one should learn as time progresses, yet in a situation such as the one we're born into, it can be said that although we're not all born premature, we're made that way after the fact because our balance is way off by human design as opposed to natural circumstances. Our situation is different from other people in that the lack of knowledge of self, the proper perspective of self and of others according to our socio-historical experience, has proven to be a formidable obstacle to progress as a group. We don't live in a world that reinforces our culture. We live in a world that reinforces the culture of those with interests that are antithetical to ours in nearly every way. For instance, on the issue of reparations, and this is just an example because I'm not actually interested in reparations from white people. My position more so is for them to leave black people alone so that we can repair the damage ourselves. And even that isn't necessarily an expectation of mine because I don't actually expect white people to operate outside of the boundaries of their culture of racism since it's predicated upon a sick attraction to African people. Nevertheless, using the issue of reparations as an example of the fact that we live in a world that reinforces the culture or thinking and behavior pattern of those with interests that are antithetical to ours, we find a few noteworthy points. Our struggle for reparations is not new. We can take it back to Cali House and beyond, and if we look in history, what we find is that every single generation of white people had an excuse to not give reparations, even to those formerly enslaved. That tradition of denying African people their due reparations has gone on for such a long time that eventually time itself became the excuse that they use. It's critical to know when you're dealing with psychopaths. We're not dealing with some kind of block in intelligence. The quote-unquote principle they rest on here is that no one is alive that enslaved African people, no one is alive now that was enslaved, and therefore no African is due reparations, and no white person is responsible for paying reparations. Now, aside from the fact of the hypocrisy of white people having a problem with paying debt incurred from the oppression of peoples, while having no problem whatsoever with the wealth and benefits they incur from the same source passed down from generation to generation, and aside from the hypocrisy of them having no problem with the converse reality of poverty and inexplicable and unwarranted debt passed down from generation to generation for black people, look at what predominantly white nations through organizations like the IMF and World Bank require from African people worldwide. Right now, they collect quote-unquote debt from African people, and in some cases, from those who were not alive when the quote-unquote debt was first incurred. We also have the case of France, for instance, taking 85% of the annual generated wealth of African people in 14 African countries. How are we indebted to them when the wealth they're sitting on is what we generated in the first place? How did we come out of slavery, Jim Crow, apartheid, colonialism, and so on, owing them and not the other way around? And keeping with the theme of